The Covenant as Peace, Federal Impulses from Althusius and Kant for an Ethics of Peace. I'll start with the outline. The first section, Introduction, the question of peace as a question of the covenant. Second, theoretical and historical lines of development in covenant theology from the Old Testament to Kant. And third, the consociation as a peaceful community of life, basic features of Althusius' federal understanding of peace. Fourth, structured comparison of Althusius' and Kant's federal approaches to war and peace. And finally, the application, federal impulses from the peace teachings of Kant and Althusius for ending the war in Ukraine. I start with the first section, Introduction. Theological resources on a path toward peace. Undoubtedly, there are many things to consider here, namely a wealth of biblical motifs and theological contexts, as well as spiritual practices. I am thinking of a spirituality of peacefulness inspired by worship practices, such as the prayer for God's peace, peace greeting, the Eucharist, and the blessing as a promise of God's peace. Certainly, biblical theological traditions of overcoming violence would also have to be explored, including visions such as the pilgrimage of nations to Zion or the ethos of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and much more. Various peace ethics concepts would also have to be examined for their theological implications. The result is a seemingly endless to-do list. However, I must limit myself and focus strictly, choosing as an example a motif that is usually underestimated in peace ethics contexts, even though it is of central importance, namely that of the covenant. This focus is unusual because normally reference is made primarily to the integrative connection between peace, law, and justice. What is generally overlooked, however, is the fact that according to the Old Testament, peace, law, and justice are realized in the covenant that God made with his people. The Old Testament scholar Hans-Joachim Kraus has emphasized this covenant structure. The discourse on peace ethics mostly ignores this when it moves within the paradigm of just peace, which is particularly relevant in the German and Anglo-Saxon speaking world, and not least in the ecumenical context. In this context, the narrow German focus on a legal ethical paradigm and Kant's liberal concept of peace through law has recently been repeatedly criticized. The criticism states, there is a tendency toward legalism with an excessive focus on international legal institutions and a conceptual neglect of civil society and religious bottom-up actors and existing cultures of peace. There is also talk of the dangers of ethical imperialism from liberal Western European models of all things. Against this backdrop, I would like to turn my attention to the covenant as a category of peace ethics, but that, in my opinion, is completely underestimated. It plays an important role in Kant's draft Perpetual Peace, 1795, and is also a genuinely theological concept. The peace-promoting potential of this concept does not need to be laboriously demonstrated. Miroslav Volf, for example, speaks of covenant and contract as the two defining metaphors for the regulation of social life. The covenant forms a basic metaphor of ethics, especially peace ethics. It should be evident that those who form alliances do so mostly with the aim of living in peace. Those who form an alliance do not shoot at their allies. The alliance is based on the desire for peace. Accordingly, NATO emphasizes that it is purely a defensive alliance and that Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty only applies in the event of an armed attack. Only then does the obligation to provide assistance apply. Of course, it is not uncommon for the alliances to be formed out of fear of a third party, a common enemy, which is characterized precisely by the fact that it stands outside the alliance. That is why alliances are often viewed with suspicion by a third party, the one standing outside the alliance. In this respect, alliances are subject to a logic of tertiarity. There are countless current examples of this, and they are certainly relevant. Just think of Russia's much discussed fear of NATO's eastward expansion, or our unease about the still rather unclear alliance between Russia, China, and India, the so-called SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Second, there we are. Theoretical and historical lines of development in covenant theology, from the Old Testament to Kant. Given its centrality in the biblical context, especially in the Old Testament, it is hardly surprising that the concept of covenant is also of particular theological significance. The key word covenant theology is extremely important for the priestly source P, but also for Deuteronomistic theology. And here too, the very close relationship between the concept of covenant and peace is striking. Gerhard von Rath has also pointed out, quote, "The relationship guaranteed by a covenant is often referred to by the word shalom, for which our word peace can only be considered as inadequate equivalent. Shalom refers to the integrity, the wholeness of a community relationship, that is a state of harmonious balance, the equilibrium of all calls and needs between two partners. Thus, a covenant seeks to achieve a state of integrity, order, and justice between two parties in order to enable a community of life between two partners on this legal basis." End of quote. It is significant that the Hebrew term berit for covenant is taken from international law, more precisely from the law of treaties against nations. In the history of theology, the category of covenant has played a special role in Reformed Protestantism. Reformed covenant or federal theology became famous in the Reformation since the days of Heinrich Bullinger and John Calvin, and subsequently in the confessional age, whereby it is striking that the covenant as a category of salvation history was used more for dogmatic than for political ethical purpose, although it also had legal historical effects. The concept of the covenant was applied, for example, in the context of the monarchomac resistance discourse after the so-called St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, whose last representative can be considered the Reformed political theorist Johannes Althusius. I will discuss him in detail below. In a political ethical context, it is entirely justified to ask whether modern contract theories and the positions of contractualism are not truncated forms of federal theology in which the covenant became a social contract. The vertical relationship between God and people was replaced by a purely horizontal, interpersonal one. God seemed to be obsolete. At any rate, God no longer had a constitutive function for the covenant in the sense of a contract. Examples of this include Thomas Hobbes' contractualist justification of absolutism in Leviathan, John Locke's derivation of liberal constitutionalism, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's justification of a directly democratic form of government. In all these concepts, the contract, in the form of a waiver of rights or a transfer of rights, served to overcome the fictitious state of nature, which is understood as being highly violent. In this respect, all these concepts are about nothing other than overcoming war and violence. The line of development outlined above culminates in a sense in Kant's draft Perpetual Peace, which became highly significant in terms of the history of ideas for the establishment of the regulatory framework of our present day. It firmly anchored the concept of the federation in international law. I refer here only to the second definitive article in Kant's treatise on peace, quote, "The right of nations shall be based on a federation of free states," end of quote. I will briefly explain this basic idea. Kant assumes that lasting peace cannot be secured by a single world empire. It is a universal state, an international state, the so-called Völkerstaat. Such a world state would easily slide into despotism and destroy the freedom of peoples. Instead, he proposes a union, or more precisely, a federation of free sovereign states, a kind of voluntary association in which states retain their independence but recognize certain common principles that prevent war. This federalism does not constitute a treaty between states for individual wars, but a permanent institution with the goal of peace. Kant explicitly refers to a federation of peoples. In the second definitive article, Kant thus presents the basic idea of an international peace order, which today is rightly associated with institutions such as the United Nations or the European Union. The core idea of Kant's fundamental concept is that states should remain free and independent. However, they mutually commit themselves to renouncing aggressive warfare. This voluntary alliance creates a framework that enables states to live in legally regulated relationships. We still benefit from the achievements of this Kantian idea today, even though it seems questionable in many respects. Critics complain, among other things, that Kantian universalism places excessive moral demands on people, including with regard to their capacity for empathy. According to Kant, a violation of rights in one part of the world is felt everywhere. In response to this criticism, I would like to attempt to examine the category of the covenant in terms of its power to promote peace ethics, and, to this end, present a covenant theological reading of Kant that interprets him from the perspective of Althusius, and Althusius from the perspective of Kant. Kant and Althusius should not be played off against each other, but understood as complementary, as concertant, in the sense of a competitive concert-like interplay, Latin concertare. To avoid misunderstandings, I'm not claiming that the approaches of Althusius and Kant could, to put it bluntly, save the world. Nor does the fact that both approaches are part of an, albeit profane, line of development in federal theology sanctify them. From a theological point of view, they will have to prove their ethical dignity by demonstrating that they correspond to God's covenant actions and thus bear witness to his story. However, exaggerated expectations that see the concept of covenant as a panacea for peace ethics and possibly even peace policy must be resolutely opposed. It will not be able to force Putin to the negotiating table. The ambivalence of the concept of covenant is already apparent in the fact that even mafia-like structures take the form of covenants, and that covenants and alliances can also be forged between autocrats and dictators. The concept of covenant is without a doubt too formal to function as a kind of passé partout for peace ethics. In any case, it needs to be supplemented. A theological ethics. Oops, I guess it was a little bit. Okay. Now?
You had jumped one.
I had jumped one. Okay.
A few minutes ago.
Yeah, there we are. Yeah, that's the right one. Yeah. A theological ethics of peace must be aware that it does not originate from some treaty, but from God's covenant with his people. And it must proceed from this basis, not least in its perception, with which the theological ethical formation of judgment begins. In this sense, it acts with covenant-shaped eyes, even when it draws a federal concepts that do not share its genuine theological interest in God's covenant, as is less true of Althusius, but certainly true of Kant. For Christian peace ethics, the self of the person forming the judgment is to be understood as the covenant itself, as Walter Brueggemann says, embedded in the way of life of the children of God living in covenant community. Third, the consortiation as a peace community of life, basic features of Althusius' federal understanding of peace. I would like to briefly introduce Althusius, who unfortunately is still little known in many places. As Peter Opitz rightly points out, he is the one who used the covenant as a contract with mutual rights and obligations as a model for shaping human coexistence according to federalist principles, and was the first to develop it comprehensively. Althusius is a reformed jurist and political theorist whose main work is the Politica Methodicae Digesta. In it, he develops a consociative political theory that is strongly influenced by Reformed theology, state theory, and legal tradition. The introduction states, quote, "Politics is the art of associating men for the purpose of establishing, cultivating, and conserving social life among them. Hence, it is called symbiotics. The subject matter of politics is therefore association, in which the symbiotes pledge themselves each to the other by explicit or tacit agreement to mutual communication of whatever is useful and necessary for the harmonious exercise of social life." End of quote. Althusius shares the federal theological view that God and people are in covenant. His approach thus takes shape and aims at the symbiotic, peaceful coexistence of allied people. The covenant or contract has a pacifying effect. Those who ally themselves with one another get along well. Althusius is concerned with a symbiotic community in which organic interrelationships flow through the social body like blood flows through our physical body. For Althusius, it is a task of politics to make such a pulsating life more human again in the dried up structures of the hierarchical social fabric. In other words, reciprocity must be built into procedures and treaties. End of quote. According to Althusius's consociative theory of the community, which focuses on consociation as a peaceful community of life, society and the state are not based on the power of an individual, as in Hobbes, for example, but on a network of associations and communities that unite from the smallest association, family, neighborhood, guild, to the top, the republic. With regard to peace, this means three things for Althusius. First, peace is a goal of every political order. Althusius understands peace not only as the absence of war, but as an orderly, just, and God-pleasing community order in which everyone knows their rights and duties. Second, peace is created through association. Since Althusius, like Aristotle, sees human as zoon politikon, creatures designed for community, peace for him cannot be achieved through coercion, but only through mutual contracts, alliances, and agreements between communities. Third, peace takes shape through law and justice. The state should use laws and constitutions to organize coexistence in such a way that disputes are settled according to just rules. Peace, therefore, also means legal peace. In summary, it can be said that for Althusius, peace does not arise solely from a monopoly on the use of force, but through the federative contractual interaction of social members, levels, and institutions. Peace is therefore the result of a just order in a multi-layered political community built from the bottom up. A structured comparison of Althusius's and Kant's federal approaches to war and peace. A comparison of Althusius and Kant reveals fundamental similarities, but also a number of differences, for example, with regard to their underlying theoretical foundations, their view of human nature, and their understanding of the state. Of course, we must take into account the different contextual locations and historical background. It is, first and foremost, the fact that Althusius, unlike Kant, was not a philosopher of the Enlightenment, but a political theorist of the early modern period. With regard to the view of human nature, Kant assumes that humans are rational and moral beings endowed with reason, who, by virtue of their reason, are capable of peace, whereas Althusius sees them as social beings who are part of political associations and tend toward cooperation, but also to conflict. According to Kant, war arises from an anarchic state between states. Accordingly, he projects a superordinate legal state at the international level. According to Althusius, war can arise when the social order between states, but also within a state, is disrupted. For him, conflicts are part of political life, but can be regulated in federations. In this regard, Althusius draws on the tradition of bellum justum, as Kant also explicitly does in the Metaphysics of Morals. Oops. There we are. Since, according to Kant, peace is based on legal foundations and treaties between states, obstacles to peace must be addressed at this political and legal level. To this end, in his treatise on peace, which takes the form of a peace treaty, he first formulates 6 preliminary articles containing the preconditions for the actual treaty, followed by 3 definitive articles that highlight the further conditions for establishing a lasting, legally secure peace. He thus makes the following demands. First, for a republican constitution of states, including separation of power and civil rights. Second, for a federation of free states which should be structured like a League of Nations and not by a world government. And third, for cosmopolitan law, including freedom of travel and trade. According to Althusius, peace also arises through federal structures which, unlike Kant's understanding, are built from the bottom up. Althusius' legal and peaceful order is historically and socially anchored and not abstractly moral as in Kant's case. To summarize the comparison, there are considerable similarities between Kant and Althusius. These include, for example, their rejection of arbitrary violence and the fact that both understand law as a basis of peace. Both focus on contracts and cooperation. Kant at the international level, Althusius at the federal level. In addition, both consider the idea of peace to be rationally feasible. For them, peace is not a utopian ideal, but something that can be achieved through institutions. Against the backdrop of these similarities, it becomes clear that Kant and Althusius are by no means opposed to each other or even mutually exclusive. I understand Althusius as a complement to Kant, in a sense, because Althusius' strengths reveal and correct Kant's weaknesses and vice versa. Kant's approach is philosophical and moral, thoroughly universalistic in orientation. Althusius' approach, on the other hand, is practical and political in orientation with a historical and sociological foundation. Unlike Kant, Althusius focuses strongly on the particular. Kant conceives of peace primarily on a global level, at the level of confederations of states and international law, while Althusius conceives of it locally or regionally in federal structures. For Kant, the causes of war are located in the lack of a legal state at the interstate level, while for Althusius it is primarily a matter of disruption of the community order or the common good at the levels below. If you will, Kant represents Noah's covenant in Genesis 9, and Althusius Abraham's covenant in Genesis 17. However, both belong very closely together in the priestly source and both are, of course, canonical. Oops. There we are. 5. Federal impulses from the peace teachings of Kant and Althusius for ending the war in Ukraine. Attempting to apply Kant and Althusius' teachings on peace to the war in Ukraine is a very bold move, of course. Neither of them offers a direct recipe or for late modern conflicts such as the war in Ukraine. However, I wonder whether the federal impulse emanating from both Kant and Althusius could not also provide food for thought for solutions. First of all, the federal impulse consists in strengthening the federal structure, and not only in the sense of forging alliances against Putin. It is good and right for the international community to condemn his war crimes in Ukraine and his policy of aggression and annexation in Ukraine clearly and sharply, and to unite against him on the basis of international law. It should be remembered that a good half, it's not my one, okay, I should be remembered that a good half of the states representing the world's population condemned Russia's attack on Ukraine, which violated international law. In the UN resolutions of March the 2nd, 2022, and of February the 23rd of 2023. It should also be remembered that the International Criminal Court, ICC, issued an international arrest warrant for the Russian president on March 17, 2023. In the long run, however, the international community and NATO will not isolate Russia, but will have to integrate it. A policy of isolation would be counterproductive from a federal perspective. Without in any way justifying or glossing over Putin's crimes, it will also be necessary to take a self-critical look at our failures in terms of unsuccessful integration from a Western or transatlantic perspective. And another idea from Althusius should be considered, albeit with some hesitation in view of the Ukraine conflict, namely the perspective on reconciliation that he introduced. Quote, "It is best when wars are ended through forgiveness." End of quote. Althusius deliberately uses a superlative here and is probably well aware of how difficult this is for the victims, especially since the term forgiveness is often used to describe a way of dealing with guilt that serves as a mechanism of repression on the part of the perpetrators rather than enabling them to feel guilty. Thirdly, no one from outside Ukraine should be allowed to dictate Ukrainians in a paternalistic manner from the comfort of their living room armchairs. As Christians who pray the Lord's Prayer, forgiveness is not left to our discretion, for it says, "As we forgive those who trespass against us." And one more point. At the Last Supper, which Jesus celebrates with his disciples as a covenant meal, he speaks of my blood of the covenant. Even the traitor, Judas, is allowed to participate. Even the covenant breaker is included by Jesus in his reconciling action. Miroslav Wolf aptly notes, quote, "The Eucharist is a ritual time in which we celebrate the divine making space of us and inviting us in. By eating and drinking the wine, we remember the broken for us who were God's enemies, and the blood spilled to establish a new covenant with us who have broken the covenant. We would most profoundly misunderstood the Eucharist, however, if we thought of it only as a sacrament of God's embrace, of which we are simply fortunate beneficiaries. Ascribed on the very heart of God's grace is a rule that we can be its recipients only if we do not resist being made into its agents. What happened to us must be done by us. End of quote. We can conclude, believers are not only embraced by God's embrace, are not simply recipients of God's grace, but are also made into agents. That is the inner logic of God's covenant instituted for the world God loves. In other words, our real tragedy in terms of peace ethics consists in that of the unforgiving servant. We act as if God's forgiveness had not taken place, as if the covenant between God and humankind did not exist, as if the world reconciled in Christ were not already reconciled. But in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. Beyond this basic theological remark, what can be said about Althusius and Kant with regard to a perspective and to war? First of all, Althusius distinguishes between a ceasefire and a peace treaty. This is important in order to be able to differentiate between peacemaking and peace building, or between the initial conditions and the conditions for consolidating and optimizing peace. This is fundamental to a post-war order that is to be built up gradually and is intended to secure lasting peace. According to Althusius, the following applies in principle to all ceasefire and peace negotiations. Quote, honorable is a peace that ends the war under just and tolerable conditions and includes friendly allies, but not one that is shameful, disgraceful, and associated with open servitude. End of quote. Kant's distinction between preliminary and definitive articles, which establish negative and positive conditions for lasting peace, is a step-by-step manner, also aims at a corresponding peace order. Some of his conditions can be applied to the war in Ukraine. For example, the first preliminary article states that there must be no secret reservations in the peace agreement, meaning that peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine must be conducted transparently and without hidden plans for annexation. This shows a clear coincidence with Althusius, who emphasizes, quote, peace is sincere when it is conducted in good faith, without falsehood and concealed warfare, end of quote. Kant's second preliminary article, according to which the acquisition of states by inheritance, purchase, or conquest is excluded, supports the argument that the Russian annexation of Ukrainian territories is inadmissible under international law, in line with his criticism of wars of conquest. Kant's third preliminary article, according to which standing armies should gradually disappear, suggests a reduction in the arms race in Europe and in the long-term confidence-building disarmament measures. Of course, the objection formulated by Althusius must be taken into account in this regard. Quote, but in order to make peace all the more secure and lasting, weapons must continue to be kept at the ready and fear must be instilled. For peace is better protected under the shield. End of quote. It is this kind of deterrence policy that is currently being pursued in Europe, but it cannot be remained in the long term and must be overcome. Based on Kant's definitive article, the second, which advocates federalism of free states and thus a League of Nations in which states cooperate as equals, should point to a strengthening and reform of international institutions in order to enable a just resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. These concern, for example, the veto power of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, including China and Russia. It also makes sense for a multilateral alliance, United Nations, European Union, OSCE, to monitor peacekeeping in post-war Ukraine. The third definitive article focuses, as we have seen, on the rights of a stranger. Here, Kant raises awareness of the importance of respecting human rights, protecting refugees, and international asylum law. Undoubtedly important issues for millions of Ukrainian refugees. Beyond Kant, who thought to provide the universal foundation for a just peace under international law, Althusius's concepts of subsidiarity and federalism must also be taken into account. Althusius raises the question of the extent to which these facilitate reconciliation within and between states. Alliances, födera, between free communities, which Althusius wants to see taken into account, could become significant in this regard. If peace is indeed achieved through the just order of communities from the bottom up, families, cities, regions, states, peoples, then with regard to Ukraine, it makes sense to respect regional autonomy within the state framework without, however, dissolving state unity. This could be particularly significant with regard to the partially occupied territories, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. In this context, Althusius also attaches importance to reciprocity. It is, for him, communities exist through mutual obligation. Applied to the war in Ukraine, Russia would have to recognize Ukrainians' right to self-determination, while Ukraine should protect its minority rights, the Russian-speaking population. As we know from political science, federalism is immensely important for limiting and resolving international conflicts and protecting minorities. This applies, above all, to the regulation of ethnic conflicts in which federal arrangement can strike a balance between unity and diversity. The principle of homogeneity of the classic nation state, however, proves to be counterproductive here. If Althusius also emphasizes the importance of the common good and makes it clear that the goal of politics is to secure the common good of all, not the prestige of individual rulers or an oligarchy, then this clearly condemns a war to expand power, as in the case of Russia, as unjust. Lasting peace cannot be based on hegemony or dominance, Russian control or Western coercion, but must take into account the legitimate interests and dignity of all communities concerned. International security architectures should also focus on cooperation and shared responsibility rather than power blocks, in line with the concept of consociation. And last slide. Oops. No. There we are, that's the last one. These suggestions must suffice at this point. It has become apparent, however, that beyond this narrow definition, the federalist idea as a political and ethical guiding principle can provide impetus for an ethics of peace. Essentially, it states that peace can only be effectively established through integration into an interpersonal union. Thinkers as diverse as Kant and Althusius have illustrated this fundamental idea. As has been shown, that two federal approaches can complement each other like the covenant of Noah and Abraham. Their concerted cooperation has resulted in important impulses for peace policy, albeit in different but complementary directions. Thank you for your patience.